60 tons and 0 shots fired. The strange story of America's last heavy tank, the M103. Picture a tank that weighs around 60 short tons, or roughly 56 metric tons, and packs a 120-millimeter gun that can punch through any armor from over a mile away. And yet not once did it fire a shot in anger. The Americans spent hundreds of millions of dollars building a tank designed to destroy Soviet heavy armor. It deployed to West Germany. It deployed to Guantanamo Bay. It never saw combat. This is the story of the M103, America's last heavy tank and one of the most troubled programs in American armor history. It all started in September 1945, when Allied forces gathered in war-torn Berlin for the Victory Parade. American, British, French, and Soviet military leaders stood on the reviewing stand to mark the end of the bloodiest war in human history. The parade had been proposed by the Soviet Union, and Marshal Georgy Zhukov himself presided over the event, opening it with a speech. Spirits were high, the enemy was defeated, and it was time to enjoy a well-earned triumph. Then Soviet tanks rolled onto the cobblestone streets of central Berlin, and the mood shifted. Rolling down the street were tanks nobody on the Allied side had seen before. These were IS-3s, the newest heavy tanks in the Soviet arsenal, and they caught everyone off guard. General George S. Patton, representing the United States on behalf of Eisenhower, watched from the reviewing stand with a hard expression. The tanks rolled past with their distinctive hemispherical turrets, sometimes compared to an upside-down soup bowl, along with their sloped armor and powerful 122-millimeter guns. That rounded, low-slung silhouette looked nothing like the boxy American Shermans, or even the newest Pershings. Nobody in the crowd that day knew the IS-3 was far from the invincible machine it appeared to be. Many of these tanks had barely survived the drive to the parade, plagued by cracked hulls, failing transmissions, and overheating engines. Of course, none of that was visible from the reviewing stand. What the generals saw was enough to set off alarm bells across military command. Here's the thing. The American Army had reached the end of World War II with tanks that were already hopelessly outdated. The main workhorse was still the M4 Sherman, reliable, mass-produced, and increasingly outgunned. Early models carried a 75-millimeter gun that struggled against the frontal armor of German Tigers and Panthers at typical combat ranges. Later variants were upgraded with a 76-millimeter gun that performed better, but even those had difficulty reliably penetrating the front of a Tiger at long range. American tankers paid a steep price when they ran into heavy German armor head-on. To deal with Tigers and Panthers, American forces leaned on combined arms tactics, coordinating tanks with infantry, artillery, and air support. It worked, but these engagements still came at a significant cost. By the end of the war, the Americans managed to develop the M26 Pershing, which could finally go toe-to-toe with German armor. The 90-millimeter gun could penetrate Panthers, and reinforced armor gave crews a fighting chance. The Pershing arrived too late, though. It only saw the final battles in Europe, and a small number shipped to the Pacific arrived after Japan's surrender. So now, staring at the Soviet IS-3s, American generals realized their newest tank was once again behind the curve. Sure, the IS-3 had thicker, better angled armor and a larger caliber gun than the Pershing on paper. Paper specs told only part of the story, though. The IS-3's crew compartment was cramped to the point of being nearly unworkable. Its rate of fire was painfully slow, and its mechanical reliability was dismal. None of that mattered to the generals watching the parade. The Cold War hadn't officially begun yet, and the tank arms race was already underway. American engineers needed to come up with an answer. An entirely new heavy tank, one capable of knocking out Soviet tanks at maximum range. Military leadership understood that if tensions with the Soviets boiled over into open war, the fields of Europe would once again become a massive tank battlefield. American tankers needed the edge. That's how the program was born that would eventually produce the M103, a tank that was supposed to be the most powerful in the world. It turned out to be an expensive disappointment. American engineers threw themselves into the work with enthusiasm, even though they didn't have a clear idea of what they actually needed. Even during the war, they had been experimenting with various heavy tank prototypes, trying to build something that could stand up to German Tigers. Engineers drew up designs for the T-29, T-30, and T-34, each one taking a different approach to the problem. Well armed, all of them. Also far too heavy and complicated to mass produce. None of the prototypes ever made it to serial production. The war ended before the engineers could finish refining their designs. Then the IS-3 showed up at that Berlin parade, and military command had to rethink its priorities. Now they needed more than just a heavy tank. They needed one that could reliably destroy the latest Soviet armor at long range. Intelligence suggested that Soviet heavy tank development was continuing, though much of what was reported turned out to be exaggerated or incomplete. By the late 1940s, word came in about a new tank, the IS-4, which featured the same 122mm gun as the IS-3, but with reinforced armor. The IS-4 turned out to be even more problematic than the IS-3, so heavy and unreliable that the Soviets quickly gave up on it and shipped most of them to the Far East. Western intelligence didn't have the full picture at the time, and the reports made the threat sound serious. American strategists worried that in the event of war, Soviet tank armies might attempt to push through the Fulda Gap into West Germany. On paper, the scenario looked terrifying. In practice, Soviet logistics probably couldn't support it. Either way, NATO planners had to take it seriously. In late 1948, engineers at the Detroit Tank Arsenal put forward the T-43 project. This tank incorporated the best innovations from previous prototypes while being lighter and more compact than its predecessors. The designers went with something revolutionary: an elliptical hull and turret shape that provided better protection at lower weight. Shells were supposed to ricochet off the curved surfaces instead of punching straight through. The frontal hull armor, thanks to its angle, gave an effective thickness of 250 millimeters, and the turret was a single massive casting with equally thick armor. For firepower, the T-43 packed a 120mm rifled T-123 gun, later standardized as the M58. It could penetrate 221 millimeters of armor at 900 meters, roughly 1,000 yards. At that range, the T-43 could engage most known Soviet tanks, while staying far enough away that return fire would be less accurate. Secondary weapons included a 50 caliber heavy machine gun on the commander's cupola and two 7.62mm machine guns mounted coaxially alongside the main gun. 5 crew members, commander, gunner, driver, and 2 loaders. You needed 2 loaders because the huge main gun rounds came in 2 pieces, a projectile and a separate propellant charge. The first T-43 prototype was ready for testing in late 1951. The tank weighed around 58 short tons and was powered by a 12-cylinder Continental gasoline engine producing 810 horsepower. 7 road wheels on each side and independent torsion bar suspension were supposed to provide a smooth ride over rough terrain. On paper, everything looked outstanding. The military was already dreaming of a tank that would settle the heavy armor question once and for all. Then Korea happened. On June 25, 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel and invaded South Korea. The American military was completely unprepared. Tank units equipped with M24 Chaffee light tanks and M4 Shermans, adequate vehicles that were poorly supplied with anti-tank ammunition, ran into North Korean T-34-85s. American tankers were taking losses again, and generals in Washington demanded that the T-43 program be fast-tracked at any cost. In January 1951, the Pentagon placed an urgent order for the new heavy tanks. Chrysler Corporation landed a contract worth $99 million, an astronomical sum at the time. The military wanted those tanks yesterday. Ship them to Korea, turn the tide. The first T-43 pilot model was completed in November 1951 and went straight to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. It's important to note that this was not yet a production tank, but a prototype. Actual serial production of the T-43E1 wouldn't begin until 1953. And that's where the trouble started. Trouble that would crush any hope of a quick win with the new superweapon. Testing at Aberdeen turned into an absolute nightmare for Chrysler's engineers. The tank the Army had been counting on was falling apart, one system after another. Transmissions overheated and broke down after just hours of driving. The engine, which ran fine on lighter vehicles like the M48, simply couldn't cope with the extra weight. Turret traverse jammed at the worst moments, and the fire control system threw off the aim so badly the gun was almost useless. The list of problems just kept growing. Sighting equipment fogged up whenever the temperature changed, making it nearly impossible to aim. Loading was too slow. The two loaders could barely keep up with the heavy shells and powder charges. The commander's hatch? Too small. In an emergency, crew members risked getting stuck trying to bail out. And the suspension fell apart under cross-country stress, with road wheels needing replacement far more often than expected. Military inspectors compiled a list of 144 required modifications. 144. That was a death sentence for a program already behind schedule. The Army ultimately approved only 98 of the simplest fixes, deciding not to waste more time on the rest. The Marine Corps, however, insisted on all 144 modifications before accepting their tanks. Army Command insisted on shipping the tanks to Korea as soon as possible, but common sense said that sending defective equipment to the front meant sending crews to their deaths. A bitter dispute erupted between Army leadership and Chrysler over who was responsible for the mess and who would foot the bill to fix it. Meanwhile, the war in Korea ground on. American forces repelled the enemy offensive, landed at Incheon, pushed almost to the Chinese border, then got pushed back by a massive Chinese counterattack. The front stabilized roughly along the same line where the fighting had started, and both sides dug in. Tank battles became increasingly rare, and the urgent need for a new heavy tank gradually faded. Chrysler's assembly line kept running anyway. The contract was signed, the money was spent. By 1954, the corporation had produced 300 tanks, designated T-43E1. Each tank cost taxpayers roughly $330,000, making it one of the most expensive pieces of armored equipment in the world. Not a single one went to Korea. On July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed, and the war they'd used to justify rushing production ended without America's new super tank ever showing up. Army Command was left in an awkward spot. 300 brand-new combat vehicles worth hundreds of millions of dollars sat in storage, riddled with defects. The tanks didn't meet Continental Army Command standards and were placed in storage in August 1955. The American military had spent a fortune on tanks that couldn't do the one job they were built for. Only after the Army's chosen 98 modifications, out of the full 144 identified, were approved did the tank finally receive the official designation M103 in April 1956. Of the 300 tanks built, 80 went to the Army and the remaining 220 were handed over to the Marine Corps. The Army only brought 74 tanks up to the new M103 standard, deciding not to waste resources on the rest. The Marines were more stubborn about it. They implemented the full set of modifications, then systematically upgraded their tanks, first to the M103A1, then to the M103A2. Even after all those fixes, the tank remained problematic. Operational range: 130 kilometers, about 80 miles. Catastrophically short for a tank that was supposed to fight across the plains of Central Europe. Top speed: 34 kilometers per hour, about 21 miles per hour. Not enough to keep up with lighter medium tanks. And at 60 short tons, most European bridges simply couldn't handle it. Command was starting to realize they'd built themselves an expensive liability, not a war-winning weapon. In July 1957, a scandal broke that thrust the heavy tank program's problems into the spotlight. A House subcommittee published a scathing report demanding a full audit of M103 spending. Investigators admitted they couldn't even determine the program's exact cost because the financial records were such a mess. By rough estimates, the program had consumed hundreds of millions of dollars for a tank that had yet to prove itself in combat. The Congressional report pulled no punches. The Army had rushed production for the Korean War, even though there was no real need for heavy tanks there. The North Koreans and Chinese didn't have anything that needed a 120mm gun to take out. Regular Shermans and Pattons handled the enemy's T-34-85s just fine. On top of that, investigators noted that the M103 was completely useless on a nuclear battlefield, which military strategists considered the most likely scenario in a future war with the Soviets. And here was the real kicker. The tank was designed to counter Soviet heavy armor in Europe, yet it was pushed into production under the pretense of urgent need in Korea, where no such threat existed. The whole thing looked like an attempt to ram through an expensive project using wartime panic as cover. Generals and contractors traded blame back and forth, but the money was gone. No getting it back. Despite the scandal, the Army still tried to find a use for its expensive toys. Starting in late 1957, M103s began shipping to Europe. According to some accounts, the first tanks arrived in the Netherlands in December 1957, with the battalion officially operational by January 1958. The Heavy Tank Battalion deployed to West Germany, where it joined the 7th Army. It was the only American heavy tank unit in Europe, and it was organized differently from standard tank battalions. The battalion consisted of 4 companies with 6 platoons each, and each platoon had 3 M103s. In total, the battalion had 72 tanks, ready to meet Soviet forces if they decided to cross the border. Initially, the battalion was assigned to the 899th Tank Battalion and later redesignated as the 2nd Battalion, 33rd Armor Regiment. The tankers ran exercises in the Bavarian forests and trained on firing ranges in the Rhineland. Crews quickly discovered exactly what the testers had warned about. The M103 was finicky and unreliable. The engine, designed for the lighter M48, was constantly pushed to its limit and demanded nonstop maintenance. Fuel consumption was monstrous. You practically needed a gas station every few miles. Army Command was also well aware of another ugly truth about their heavy tank. During World War II, more German Tigers were lost during retreats than in actual combat. They broke down, got stuck, and were abandoned by their crews when fuel ran out or recovery vehicles couldn't reach them. The M103 had exactly the same problem. Its weight made recovering a damaged vehicle practically impossible under combat conditions, and its thirst for fuel created a logistical nightmare. In a retreat, the American Army risked losing every last one of its heavy tanks without ever firing a shot. The M103's greatest asset remained its gun. The 120mm M58 cannon was, no exaggeration, one of the most powerful tank guns anybody had built up to that point. 7.6 meters long, roughly 25 feet. Its armor-piercing round left the barrel at 1,067 meters per second. At 1,800 meters, roughly a mile, it could punch through 196 millimeters of armor at a 30-degree angle. The M103 could destroy any Soviet tank before that tank even got close enough to shoot back effectively. 34 rounds of separate loading ammunition. Rate of fire wasn't great, but the military figured that with that kind of accuracy and hitting power, speed mattered less. One well-placed shot from an M103 was worth a dozen rounds from a medium tank. That was the whole point of the thing. Starting in the early 1960s, military thinking took a sharp turn that spelled the end for the entire concept of heavy tanks. Generals and strategists concluded that the future belonged not to narrowly specialized tanks, but to versatile ones that could handle any job on the battlefield. One tank that combined the firepower of a heavy with the mobility of a medium. That was the main battle tank doctrine, and the M103, with its narrow specialization, was suddenly a relic. Meanwhile, intelligence confirmed what had been hinted at for years. The Soviet heavies, the M103, was built to fight, were deeply flawed. As mentioned earlier, the IS-3 suffered from chronic hull cracking, transmission failures, and engine problems. The IS-4 was even heavier than the M103 and so impractical that it spent most of its service life rusting in depots in the Soviet Far East. Both sides had poured enormous resources into heavy tanks that turned out to be engineering dead ends. The Soviets had shifted their focus to mass-producing the lighter T-54 and T-55, prioritizing numbers and simplicity over the heavy tank approach that had proven problematic for both sides. Against those tanks, the M103's 120mm gun was overkill. In 1963, the Army decided to disband all heavy tank units. The M103 battalion in Europe ceased to exist, and the tanks were shipped back across the Atlantic. Army command had completely soured on the concept it had poured so much money and effort into. The M103 was replaced by the M60, a next-generation main battle tank that paired decent firepower with vastly better mobility and reliability. The Army couldn't get rid of its cumbersome heavies fast enough. The Marine Corps, though, different story entirely. The Marines kept operating their M103s, systematically upgrading them and adapting them to their own needs. In 1964, the M103A2 version appeared, equipped with a diesel engine from the M60 tank. The new 750 horsepower motor consumed significantly less fuel, boosting the operational range to 480 kilometers, about 300 miles. Compare that to the pathetic 130 kilometers of the original version. Night and day, the Marines saw the M103 as the perfect support weapon for beach landings. That gun could flatten coastal fortifications and bunkers, clearing the way for infantry. And the thick armor kept crews alive under anti-tank fire while the beachhead was secured. Sources disagree on the exact number upgraded to the A2 standard. Wikipedia's variant list says 153 were converted, while other parts of the same article and several secondary sources cite 154. The historian Kenneth Estes, in his 2013 study, states that 218 M103A1s were converted to the A2 standard for the Marine Corps. Regardless of the exact figure, these tanks stayed in service at Marine Corps bases across the country. Still, not a single M103 ever saw actual combat. 5 were deployed to Guantanamo Bay during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and that was as close as they got. During the Vietnam War, Command didn't even consider sending heavy tanks into the jungles of Southeast Asia. Vietnam called for light, maneuverable vehicles, not 60-ton monsters that would sink into the first swamp they hit. The M103 was built for tank duels on the plains of Central Europe, but those duels never made it off the planning table. Think about that for a second. The most powerful American tank of its time spent nearly its entire career on training ranges and in parades. Its crews prepared for a war that never came. They honed their gunnery skills on targets shaped like Soviet tanks and rehearsed battle tactics for terrain they'd never set tracks on. The M103 became a perfect symbol of the Cold War. Enormous arsenals built for a fight nobody wanted to start. The Army had already retired the M103 back in 1963, replacing it with the M60. The Marine Corps held on much longer, finally retiring its last heavy tanks between 1972 and 1974. Most were sent to storage depots, gradually stripped for parts or scrapped. A handful sit in museums across America, silent monuments to an era when both superpowers pushed the heavy tank concept to its limits before concluding that the future lay elsewhere. America's last heavy tank faded into history without ever firing a single shot in combat. Was it a colossal waste of money? Probably. Did its mere existence help keep the Soviets from trying anything reckless? Maybe. Either way, the M103 is gone, and it's not coming back. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the Cold War's strangest tank programs, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment about what other military hardware you'd like to hear about. And don't forget to hit the bell so you don't miss new videos.